The obelisk had been humming since dawn, and Torek Vassal was the only one in the museum who noticed. He stood in the restoration bay beneath the Hesserin Archive Museum's south wing, his four-fingered hands resting flat on the diagnostic table, and listened. The sound was not audible in the conventional sense. It traveled through the building's stone substrate, through the reinforced flooring, through the soles of his boots, and into the dense cartilage of his Sethari ankle bones, where it registered as a sustained, faintly nauseating pressure that had no business being there. The obelisk, catalogued as Exhibit 7714 null, a navigational relic recovered from a dead city on the desert moon of Keth Soranis, had been silent for the entire 11 years Torek had supervised its display. Silent for the 4 centuries before that, according to every provenance record the Hesserin archive possessed. Silent, in fact, for the estimated 9,000 years since whatever civilization had built it had stopped existing. Passive basalt housing, inactive circuitry, no energy signature, the museum registry read. Classification, ornamental, display recommendation, ambient lighting, no interactive access. 9,000 years of silence. And now, on a morning so ordinary that the only scheduled event was a public tour at 10:30, the thing was humming. Torek pulled up the diagnostic feed on his tablet. Flat. Every sensor embedded in the display pedestal read 0. No thermal shift, no electromagnetic output, no vibrational frequency the instruments could detect. According to the machines, the obelisk was still dead. But Torek had spent 26 years running excavations on worlds where the machines said a site was empty right, until the moment the ground opened and swallowed someone's survey drone. He trusted his ankle-bones more than he trusted a sensor array calibrated by a museum technician who thought ancient meant anything older than her government's founding charter. He sealed the diagnostic bay, walked to the adjacent records room, and pulled the obelisk's full provenance file from the archive's deep catalog. It was thicker than he remembered. 11 years of his own annotations, plus the original field reports from the Keth Soranis excavation, plus 4 centuries of prior custodial records from every institution that had housed the artifact before the archive acquired it. He flipped to the interaction log, the section where every attempted activation was recorded. There had been 47 deliberate attempts to wake Exhibit 7714 null over the 412 years since its recovery. Resonance probes, electromagnetic bombardment, tonal frequency sweeps across every audible and subaudible band known to galactic science. 3 separate attempts to inject energy directly into the metallic veining through conductive filaments, all of which had resulted in the filaments melting and the veining remaining inert. A Palathi acoustics team had spent 8 months singing at it, literally singing, their species' primary mode of technological interface, and had produced nothing but a 600-page report concluding that the artifact was either dead or listening for a frequency no living species could produce. The 47th attempt had been Torek's own, during the excavation. He had placed a calibrated vibration emitter against the base of the obelisk and run through every frequency profile in the Sethari archaeological toolkit. The obelisk had sat in the desert sand and done absolutely nothing, and Torek had written in his field journal, confirmed inert, recommend classification as structural ornamental. If this object was ever a functioning instrument, it is not one now. And now it was humming, on a Tuesday, during business hours. He closed the file, sealed the records room, and climbed the service stairs to the public gallery. The south wing of the Hesserin archive was a long, vaulted corridor with arched windows that ran from floor to ceiling along the eastern wall, flooding the space with the pale blue-white daylight of Hesserin Prime's twin suns. The exhibits lined the western wall in shallow alcoves, each one lit from above by focused daylight channeled through fiber-optic skylights. It was a beautiful space. Torek had always thought so, even before the archive had hired him as senior conservator and given him authority over the entire xenoarchaeological collection. The light here was honest. It did not flatter the artifacts. It showed them as they were: old, weathered, broken, silent, stripped of whatever power they had once held, reduced to shapes and surfaces that scholars could catalog and visitors could photograph, and everyone could agree meant nothing dangerous. The obelisk sat in the sixth alcove from the entrance. It was not large. 2 meters tall, roughly square in cross-section, tapering to a blunted point at the top. The surface was dark gray basalt laced with veins of something metallic that caught the daylight and held it, not reflecting, exactly, but retaining, as if the metal remembered what light was and was reluctant to let it leave. There were inscriptions on every face, dense, layered, overlapping geometric patterns that Torek's own excavation team had spent 3 field seasons trying to decode before concluding that they were not text at all but something closer to circuit diagrams rendered in stone. Nobody had ever activated those circuits. Nobody had ever come close. Torek stopped at the alcove's railing and listened again. The hum was louder here, but still subaudible to any species that didn't process vibration through bone. He crouched, pressed his palm flat against the gallery floor and felt it. A steady pulse, like a heartbeat, rising through the stone from somewhere beneath the pedestal. Something had changed. Something this morning in this building had changed, and the obelisk was responding. He stood, pulled his communicator from his belt, and called the front desk. "This is Vassal, who is on the public tour schedule for the South Wing this morning." A pause, the sound of a registry being checked. "Ewan Marsh, sir, the human. He has the 10:30. Torek closed his eyes. Of course it was Marsh. Ewan Marsh had been a tour guide at the Hessoran Archive Museum for 7 years, and in that time he had given approximately 2,400 guided walks through the xenoarchaeological galleries. He knew every exhibit by catalog number. He knew the provenance chains, the excavation dates, the conservation histories, the academic disputes. He knew which alcoves drew the most visitors, the Velori War Mask in the North Wing, always, and which ones people walked past without stopping, the obelisk in the South Wing, always. He knew the temperature at which the climate control system in Gallery 6 would trigger a humidity alarm, and which floor tiles in the East Corridor had been improperly sealed and would click under foot traffic on humid days. He was not a scholar. He was not an archaeologist. He had no advanced degrees, no published papers, no field experience. He was a 43-year-old human male who had taken a job giving tour because the archive was the only employer on Hessoran Prime willing to hire a species whose homeworld most of the local population had never heard of. He was good at the job. He was thorough, patient, and genuinely interested in the artifacts. Visitors liked him because he treated the exhibits not as dead objects in cases, but as things that had once mattered to someone, and he made that matter visible in the way he spoke about them. None of which explained why the obelisk had started humming the same morning he was scheduled to walk past it. Torek had tried to stop the tour. He had called the front desk and asked them to reschedule Marsh to the North Wing. The desk clerk, a young Hessoran female who had been on the job less than a month, had informed him that the North Wing's morning guide was already en route, and the schedule could not be changed without administrative approval, which required a form, which required a department head signature, which could not be obtained until after the morning shift change at 11. Bureaucracy, the one force in the galaxy more immovable than a 9,000-year-old navigational obelisk. By the time Torek had abandoned the administrative channel and gone to find Marsh directly, the tour group had already assembled in the South Wing atrium. He arrived at the upper gallery, overlooking the corridor just as Marsh led his group through the entrance. 12 visitors today, a mix of Hessoran families and a pair of off-world merchants who looked bored already. A Sethari academic, one of Torek's own species, a young female with the pale markings of a university researcher, was trailing at the back of the group with a recording device that she was not supposed to be using inside the gallery. Marsh walked ahead of them with the easy, unhurried stride of a man who had covered this ground so many times his body could do it without consulting his brain. He was wearing the Archive's standard guide uniform, dark jacket, identification lanyard, soft-soled shoes, and carrying the small handheld projector he used to display supplemental images during the tour. He stopped at the first alcove, a Pelathi star compass, 3,000 years old, recovered from a burial mound on Acrose IV. Marsh talked about it for 90 seconds, the craftsmanship, the navigational principles, the burial practice that placed a compass with the dead so they could find their way to the afterworld. His voice carried well in the vaulted corridor. Calm, measured, the cadence of someone who believed what he was saying. Torek felt the floor shift, not a tremor, a tightening, as if the stone beneath the gallery had clenched. The hum changed pitch. It was tracking Marsh, following his footsteps as he moved from the first alcove to the second. Second alcove, a matched pair of Astheny relay discs, 1/2 meter in diameter, carved from a single piece of polished granite and edged with the same unidentifiable metallic compound that laced the obelisk's surface. They had been found on opposite sides of a mountain range on Keth Soranis, identical twins separated by 300 kilometers of desert, and no one had ever determined whether they were ceremonial or functional. Marsh held up his projector and showed the mountain range in cross-section, the two fine sites marked in red. Whoever placed these meant them to talk to each other, he said. Across 300 kilometers of rock, we don't know how. We just know they were positioned, with the kind of precision that says someone cared very much about getting it right. The relay discs did nothing. They had been dead for as long as the Archive had held them. But the floor beneath them hummed louder as Marsh spoke, and when Torek pressed his hand to the wall beside the second alcove, he felt the vibration running laterally through the stone, not just downward, from the obelisk's pedestal, but sideways, as if the building itself was conducting the signal from one point to another. Third alcove, fourth. At the fourth, something happened that Torek almost missed. The exhibit was a fragment of a Tessavari root stone, a chip of basalt the size of a man's palm, inscribed with a single geometric node, housed in a preservation case. As Marsh stopped in front of it and began his narration, the metallic veining in the fragment caught the daylight from the overhead skylight and held it, not reflecting, holding. The same behavior Torek had documented on the obelisk's surface 11 years ago, the same phenomenon he had written off as a material property. But the fragment had never done it before, not in 11 years of continuous display, not under the same daylight, at the same angle, on the same pedestal. The only variable was the voice. Torek's professional calm fractured exactly 1 centimeter. He pulled his tablet from his jacket and began recording. Fifth alcove, a Dramathi ceremonial blade, the handle inlaid with circuit glass that had once powered a force-edge but had been dead for 6 centuries. Marsh held the projector up and showed a reconstruction of the blade's original energy signature. The group leaned in. One of the Hessoran children asked if the blade could still cut. Marsh said, "Not anymore, but the people who made it wanted you to know it once could. That's why they built it to last, so the memory of what it could do would survive longer than the power itself." In the fourth alcove, behind them, the Tessavari fragment pulsed. A single brief flare of amber light from the metallic veining, so faint that none of the tour group noticed, so brief that if Torek had blinked he would have missed it. But he did not blink, and his tablet was recording, and the data feed showed a spike. A real, measurable electromagnetic spike from an artifact that had been classified as inert since the day it was pulled from the ground. The obelisk was not just responding, it was recruiting, waking the other Tessavari pieces in the collection, one by one, alcove by alcove, following the sound of a human voice. Sixth alcove. The obelisk. Torek's hands tightened on the gallery railing. Marsh stopped in front of the display. He had done this thousands of times. His posture did not change. His breathing did not change. He turned to face the group and began his standard narration. "This is Exhibit 7714 Null," he said. "Recovered from the ruins of a city on Keth Soranis, a desert moon in the Vorath system. The excavation team, led by our own senior conservator Vassal, actually spent 3 seasons studying it in the field before bringing it here. The material is a basalt composite with metallic veining that we haven't been able to identify with certainty, though the leading theory is that it's a form of crystallized data substrate. The inscriptions are not text. They're closer to engineering diagrams, the blueprint of a machine rendered in stone." He paused, the way he always did at this point. Then he said the line he had been saying for 7 years, the line Torek had heard him deliver hundreds of times from this exact spot. "No one has ever been able to turn it on. No one has ever figured out what it was for. It's been silent for 9,000 years. We keep it because silence is also a kind of record. Sometimes the most important thing an artifact can tell you is that it's waiting." The obelisk lit up. Not gradually, not a fading in warmth, not a slow ignition sequence. The metallic veins across every surface flared to life in a single coordinated pulse. All 4 faces at once, every circuit line, every geometric node blazing with a deep, steady amber light that filled the alcove and threw Marsh's shadow hard against the gallery wall behind him. The group scattered. The Hessoran child who had asked about the blade screamed. The off-world merchants stumbled backward into each other. Marsh did not move. He stood with his back to the obelisk, still facing the space where his audience had been, his projector still in his right hand, his left hand hanging at his side. The amber light washed over him from behind, and for a long suspended moment he looked like a man standing in a doorway with the sun behind him, backlit, ordinary, still. Then he turned around. Torek was already running. He hit the service stairs at a full sprint, his tablet clattering against his hip, his communicator in his hand barking orders. "Seal the south wing, get Dr. Penne from conservation, get security to the 6th alcove. Nobody touches anything." And by the time he reached the gallery floor, 22 seconds after the activation, the obelisk had changed. The amber light had settled into a stable, rhythmic pulse. The geometric patterns on the surface were moving, not spinning, not scrolling, but rearranging. The circuit lines rewriting themselves in real time, nodes connecting and disconnecting in sequences that Torek recognized from his 3 seasons in the field as the operational language he had spent years trying to decode and had never cracked. The obelisk was running. Whatever it was designed to do, it was doing it now, and it was doing it because a human tour guide had been standing in front of it, saying the same words he said every day, at the distance he always stood, in the voice he always used. "Marsh," Torek's voice came out harder than he intended. "Step away from the exhibit." Marsh was standing close now, closer than the railing should have allowed, except the railing had retracted. Torek stared at the floor. The railing's floor bolts had withdrawn into the stone. The obelisk had pulled its own safety barrier down. Behind them, alcove 4 was glowing. The Tessavari fragment's amber pulse had strengthened from a faint flicker to a visible light source, and the metallic veining on its surface was moving. The single geometric node rearranging itself into something that looked like a compass rose, pointing in the direction of the obelisk. In alcove 2, the Astheni relay discs had begun to vibrate on their pedestals, producing a harmonic that was audible now. A low, clear tone that resonated with the obelisk's deeper hum like 2 instruments playing the same chord. The security guard stationed at the south wing entrance had noticed. He was speaking into his communicator with the clipped urgency of a man who did not have a protocol for artifacts waking themselves up. "Marsh, did you touch it?" "No," Marsh's voice was level, but there was something in it that Torek had never heard before, not fear, not excitement, but a kind of focused stillness, the sound of a man listening to something he had been hearing for a long time without knowing it. I didn't touch anything. I was giving the tour. I said what I always say. What you always say. Yes. Torek looked at the obelisk. The patterns were still moving, still rewriting. But they had slowed, and now he could see structure in them, not random recombination but directed assembly, as if the obelisk was building something specific, one circuit node at a time, and was waiting for something before it finished. He glanced at his tablet. The electromagnetic reading from the obelisk was climbing, not spiking, not surging, but climbing steadily, the way a signal climbs when it is not being generated but received. The obelisk was not producing power. It was drawing it from somewhere, from the fragment, from the relay disks, from the building's own substrate. The Tesavari had built a distributed system, and Marsh's voice had connected its nodes. Say it again, Torek said. What? What you said, the line about silence, say it again. Marsh looked at him. Then he turned back to the obelisk and spoke. We keep it because silence is also a kind of record. Sometimes the most important thing an artifact can tell you is that it's waiting. The obelisk flared. A second wave of amber light pulsed outward from its surface, brighter than the first, and this time Torek heard something, not through his ankle bones, not through the floor, but through the air, through the actual audible spectrum. A deep resonant tone that filled the gallery corridor and rattled the fiber-optic skylights in their housings. The moving patterns on the surface froze. Then they reformed. All four faces of the obelisk cleared simultaneously, every line and node vanishing as if wiped, and in their place a single inscription appeared, carved into the stone in real time, the basalt splitting along precise geometric channels as if guided by an invisible chisel, the metallic veining flowing into the new channels like liquid mercury finding its level. 3 words, rendered in the geometric script that Torek's team had spent years failing to decode, but accompanied now by a phonetic transliteration in a trade script old enough that it predated the Hessoran archive itself, but recent enough that Torek could still read it. He read it. His hands went still. The words said, "Speak your root." Marsh was staring at the obelisk. The amber light was on his face, turning his ordinary human features, the tired eyes, the clean-shaven jaw, the faint scar on his left temple from a childhood accident he had once mentioned to Torek in passing, into something that looked carved from the same stone as the relic itself. It's asking me something, Marsh said. Yes. What does it say? It says, "Speak your root." Marsh was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, "I don't have a route, I'm a tour guide. I walk the same halls every day." The obelisk pulsed. A third wave of light, and this one was different. This one did not radiate outward, it contracted. The amber glow pulled inward, concentrating into the 3 inscribed words until they burned like brands in the stone surface. And then the obelisk emitted a sound that was not a tone but a voice. Not a human voice, not a Sethari voice, not the voice of any species Torek had encountered in 26 years of fieldwork across 9 planetary systems. It was a voice that sounded like stone learning to speak, deep, textured, layered with harmonics that suggested enormous mass and enormous patience, the kind of patience that could wait 9,000 years for a specific set of words to be spoken in its presence by a specific kind of throat. The voice said, "You have been speaking the root for 7 years. Every path you describe to the ones who listen. Every connection you draw between the things that were built and the hands that built them. Every artifact you have touched with your voice and made live again in the minds of strangers. That is the root. You have been walking it since you arrived." The gallery was silent. Torek realized he was not breathing. Marsh looked at the obelisk. His face had not changed, no shock, no revelation, no dramatic widening of the eyes. There was only a slight softening around his mouth, the kind of expression Torek had seen on the faces of people who finally heard spoken aloud a thing they had always felt but never found words for. "I don't understand," Marsh said quietly. The obelisk answered him. "The long road is not a distance, it is a practice. The builders of this instrument walked it for 10,000 generations before they fell. They carried knowledge not in vaults but in voices, speaking the shape of things to those who would listen, connecting what was made to what was meant, holding the thread between the ones who built and the ones who will build again. The road does not require power. It does not require rank. It requires someone who stands before the silent and the forgotten and says, 'This mattered. Someone was here. This is what they left.'" The amber light was steady now, no longer pulsing. The metallic veins across the obelisk's surface had settled into a new configuration, not the dense, unreadable complexity of before, but a clean, open geometric pattern that looked, to Torek's practiced eye, like a star chart. Not a modern chart, not a chart of any system he recognized, but a chart of routes, paths between points, connections between nodes, the skeleton of a network so old and so vast that the idea of it made something in Torek's professional composure crack. "Who am I supposed to be?" Marsh asked. The obelisk spoke its last line. "You are the architect of the long road." The words landed in the gallery like a stone dropped into still water. Torek felt them in his chest, not as vibration, not as sound, but as weight. The kind of weight that comes when something that has been waiting to be said for 9,000 years finally finds the mouth it was waiting for. Marsh stood in the amber light and said nothing. Around the gallery, the 9 subsidiary artifacts pulsed in unison, one synchronized beat, like a heartbeat, like a confirmation. The relay discs in alcove 2, the fragment in alcove 4, the curved plating, the cylindrical core, the 3 coin-sized tokens scattered across different display cases. All of them answered the obelisk's last line with a single pulse of amber light, and then they held, glowing steadily, the distributed network stabilized around the man who had connected it. The Sethari academics recording device captured everything. She would publish the footage 11 days later. Within a month, it would be the most viewed xenoarchaeological document in galactic history. But that was later. In the gallery, in the silence after the obelisk named him, there was only the amber light, the steady hum of a machine that had finished its work, and a human tour guide standing before the artifact he had described to strangers 2,400 times without knowing that it was describing him back. By noon, the south wing was sealed. Security teams from the Archives Administration blocked every entrance. Dr. Penne, the head of conservation, arrived with a mobile diagnostic array and spent 40 minutes running scans that returned results she said were impossible, 3 times before she stopped saying it and started recording. Every Tessavari artifact in the South Wing collection was active now. There were 9 of them: the obelisk, the relay discs, the rootstone fragment, and 5 other pieces that had been scattered across different alcoves and display cases, cataloged under different headings, attributed to different periods, none of them previously identified as part of a connected system. A curved section of metallic plating in alcove 9, a cylindrical stone core in the end of corridor case. 3 geometric tokens the size of coins, displayed as jewelry in the decorative arts section of the wing. All 9 glowed with the same amber light. All 9 hummed at harmonics that, when Dr. Penne's instruments measured them simultaneously, resolved into a single complex chord. A chord that was, Torek realized with a sensation he could only describe as professional vertigo, a carrier signal. The Tessavari network was broadcasting. The obelisk was the hub. Every sensor that had read 0 that morning now registered output across 17 distinct frequency bands. The star chart on its surface was not static. It was updating, node by node, as if the instrument was recalculating routes in real time based on the current positions of stellar bodies that had moved thousands of light years since the chart was last drawn. The 9 subsidiary artifacts were feeding it data, their individual outputs contributing nodes, routes, and correction vectors to a map that was assembling itself in real time from the combined resonance of pieces that had been separated across a museum gallery for over a decade and across a planetary surface for centuries before that. Dr. Penne's team identified 6 of the charted systems. 3 were known colonial territories. 2 were deep-range exploration targets that had not yet been reached by any living civilization. 1 did not appear on any existing galactic survey. Torek stood in the observation alcove above the gallery and watched Marsh. They had asked him to stay. Not ordered, the archive had no authority to order a tour guide to do anything beyond his contract, but asked, and Marsh had agreed with the quiet compliance of a man who understood that something had changed and that leaving the room would not change it back. He sat on the gallery bench across from the obelisk, his hands on his knees, his projector set down beside him, and looked at the active relic with an expression that Torek could not categorize. Torek had been an excavation leader for more than 2 decades. He had pulled artifacts from the dirt of 11 worlds. He had seen dormant technology reactivate. Once, on Keth Sorani's itself, a buried thermal regulator had fired when a survey team drove a ground-penetrating probe into its housing, and the resulting heat pulse had fused the probe and half a meter of surrounding sand into glass. That was activation by accident, by mechanical intrusion, by a tool touching a trigger. It was comprehensible. It followed rules. This was different. This was an artifact that had been surrounded by tools for 11 years, diagnostic probes, conservation instruments, imaging arrays, every piece of technology the archive possessed, and had responded to none of them. It had responded to a man talking. Not talking to it, talking about it. Talking about it to strangers in the same words, in the same cadence, day after day, year after year, with no intention beyond doing his job well. And the obelisk had listened, had measured, had, in the language of its builders, been walked. The Sethari academic from the tour group had not fled with the rest of the visitors. She was standing at the sealed entrance to the south wing, her recording device pressed against the glass, capturing everything she could see from the corridor. Torek noticed her, noted her presence, and made a decision that surprised him. He let her stay. She was a scholar. She would understand, eventually, what she was witnessing. And someone outside the archive staff should see this. Someone who could verify, independently, that it had happened. He was already thinking like a man whose career had just divided itself into before and after. Torek descended to the gallery floor. "I need to understand something," he said, pulling a chair from the staff alcove and sitting across from Marsh. "The line you say during the tour, the one about silence being a record, where did you learn it?" Marsh looked at him. "I wrote it myself, first week on the job. I was trying to figure out what to say about an exhibit that had no story, no decoded text, no known function, no dramatic history, just a rock that wouldn't talk. So I wrote a line about why we keep the things that won't talk. And you've said it every tour since then." "Every tour, same words. I liked the way it sounded." 7 years. Approximately 2,400 repetitions. "If you want to put a number on it." Torek leaned back. The amber light from the obelisk played across the floor between them, steady and warm. "The civilization that built this artifact," Torek said, "is called the Tessavari in our records. We know almost nothing about them. They occupied Keth Sorani's and at least 5 other moons in the Voreth system for an estimated 10,000 generations. They built in stone and metal. Their technology was sophisticated but entirely non-digital, no electronic computing, no energy weapons, no faster-than-light capability that we've identified. They navigated by voice." Marsh raised an eyebrow. "By voice," Torek repeated. "Their navigation instruments were resonance-activated. The Tesavari stored root data not in databases but in spoken pattern chains, sequences of words calibrated to specific tonal frequencies that the instruments could receive and decode. A navigator did not input coordinates. A navigator spoke the root, and the instrument listened, verified, and responded. So when it said I'd been speaking the root, it was being precise. You were. Not the same route a Tesavari navigator would have spoken. You don't know their language, you don't know their tonal calibrations. You were not trained. But you were doing the thing the instrument was built to detect. You were standing in front of it, repeatedly, in a consistent voice, speaking structured descriptions of objects and their origins. The same class of verbal pattern a Tesavari navigator used to establish a route chain. The instrument didn't need the language. It needed the practice. Marsh sat with that for a moment. The gallery was quiet except for the sound of Dr. Penne's team working behind the sealed doors at the far end of the corridor. That's why it didn't respond to the probes, Marsh said, or the scans, or any of the diagnostic equipment. Correct, those are passive instruments. They observe. The obelisk was not waiting to be observed. It was waiting to be spoken to. Or more precisely, it was waiting for someone who spoke to silent things as a habit, as a practice, as a vocation. I'm a tour guide, Torek. I'm not a navigator. The Tesavari word for navigator, Torek said, translates most closely as the one who walks the road between what was made and what will be understood. A keeper of connections, a voice that holds the thread. They did not distinguish between a navigator who charted stars and a teacher who charted meaning. Both walked the long road. Both carried the roots. Marsh looked at the obelisk. The star chart on its surface was still updating. One of the nodes, a point in the lower quadrant of the visible face, had begun to pulse brighter than the others, a warm gold that stood out against the ambient amber like a beacon. "What's that one?" Marsh asked. Torek stood and approached the display. He pulled his tablet from his jacket and cross-referenced the pulsing node against the 6 systems Dr. Penne's team had already identified. It was not one of the 6. He checked the deep-range exploration targets, not there either. He ran the coordinates through the Galactic Positioning Service, a cross-reference database containing every charted system, every surveyed region, every mapped anomaly in the known galaxy. The search returned 0 results. He expanded the search to include historical surveys, records from civilizations that had mapped regions of space before the current survey infrastructure existed. The Valori Cartographic Archive, the Hessoran Expansion-era charts, the Deep Antiquity records from the archive's own collection, some of which predated faster-than-light travel. Nothing. He tried one more thing. He ran the coordinates against the Tesavari site maps from the Keth Sorani's excavation, his own field data, the surveys he had conducted over 3 seasons on a desert moon that had been dead for 9,000 years. The coordinate system was different, the reference frames incompatible, but his tablet ran the conversion automatically. One match. The pulsing node corresponded, within a margin of error smaller than a planetary diameter, to a directional indicator on a wall fragment his team had uncovered in the 3rd season and catalogued as decorative. A carved arrow pointing at nothing in a dead city on a dead moon, 9,000 years old. It had been pointing at this. "It's not charted," Torek said. His voice was very controlled. "That system doesn't appear in any record we possess, but the Tesavari knew where it was. They carved a marker for it into the walls of their city. We found it. We catalogued it. We thought it was decoration." Marsh got up from the bench and walked to the obelisk. He stood before it the way he always stood when giving his tour, feet shoulder-width apart, hands at his sides, head slightly tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. "Can I ask it something?" he said. Torek hesitated. Every professional instinct told him to say no, to seal the artifact, summon a xenoarchaeological committee, file emergency protocols with the Hesseran Cultural Authority, spend 6 months building a controlled interaction framework before allowing anyone to exchange another syllable with a 9,000-year-old navigational AI that had just woken up. He thought of the provenance file in the records room. 47 failed activation attempts, 412 years, 8 Pelathi acousticians singing for 8 months, his own vibration emitter pressing against the obelisk's base on a desert moon while the twin suns burned overhead and the sand turned to glass around it. Every one of those attempts had followed protocol. Every one had been approved by a committee. Every one had produced nothing. The committee had had its chance, 412 years of chances. The committee had concluded that the artifact was dead. The tour guide had concluded that it was waiting. One of them had been right. Ask, Torek said. Marsh looked at the pulsing node on the star chart. Then he spoke, in the same calm, measured tone he used for every exhibit, every alcove, every artifact he had ever stood beside and translated for strangers. What is that place? The obelisk answered, not with the deep stone voice of before, with something quieter, almost intimate, the voice of a machine calibrated to speak to one person at a time. That is the convergence, the terminus of the long road. Every route the builders ever charted leads to it. Every voice that ever carried a route added one more line to the map that ends there. It was the purpose. It is still the purpose. What's there? The builders, what they made, what they left for the one who would complete the map. Marsh turned to Torek. The amber light was on both of them now, and Torek saw something in the human's face that he had never seen in all his years of working with field teams and scholars and government officials who handled artifacts as career instruments. A look of pure, unfiltered recognition, not of the artifact, of himself. The look of a man who had just realized that the thing he had been doing every day without thinking about it, the thing he had dismissed as routine, as simple, as the work of a guide and nothing more, was the thing. The actual thing, the practice the builders had designed their most important instrument to detect. It's been listening to me for 7 years, Marsh said, counting. Measuring, Torek corrected. The Tessavari instruments measured commitment, consistency. The long road was not a test of skill, it was a test of devotion. Could you keep speaking to the silent? Could you keep treating the dead as worth knowing? Could you keep walking the same halls, standing before the same objects, saying the same words, when no one answered and no one cared and the rational thing to do was stop? I never thought about stopping, Marsh said. I know, Torek said. That's why it chose you. The gallery fell quiet. Outside the arched windows, the twin suns of Hesseran Prime had reached their midday convergence, and the pale blue-white light that filled the corridor was at its brightest, washing over the obelisk, and the man standing before it in a cool, even radiance that made the amber glow of the active circuits look like candlelight against a winter sky. Torek heard footsteps behind him. Dr. Penne had come through the sealed doors, her diagnostic array forgotten, her staff trailing behind her. The security team stood in the corridor entrance, their weapons holstered, their faces carrying the slack expression of people watching something they did not have a protocol for. 3 of Torek's former excavation colleagues, Hesseran archaeologists who had spent years handling dead artifacts and classified reports, stood among them with their tablets hanging at their sides, unread. All of them were looking at Marsh. And Marsh was looking at the obelisk. The star chart had completed its update. Every node was lit. Every route was drawn. The map that the Tessavari had spent 10,000 generations building, voice by voice, navigator by navigator, route by route, was finished, completed by a human tour guide who had done nothing more remarkable than show up every morning and talk to a rock that refused to answer. Until it did. The obelisk spoke one more time, not to the room. not to the gathered scholars and officials and security personnel who stood in the corridor with their mouths open and their certainties rearranging. It spoke to Marsh, in the voice calibrated for one, in the tone that 9,000 years of silence had been shaping for this specific throat and this specific ear. The route is complete, the map is finished. The long road has an end and you have drawn the last line. Will you walk it? Marsh stood still. The amber light pulsed once, a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, the relic's patience made visible. Around the gallery, every surface the metallic veins touched caught the light and held it. And for one breath the entire south wing of the Hesserin Archive Museum looked like the inside of a living machine. A navigation instrument the size of a building, waking up around the man who had walked its corridors every day without knowing he was walking anything at all. Torek watched. He had been an excavation leader for 26 years. He had unearthed artifacts on 11 worlds. He had held fragments of civilizations older than his species' written history, and felt the specific grief of knowing that the people who made them were gone, and the things they left behind were all that proved they had ever existed. He had never seen an artifact choose. He had never seen the dead reach back. Marsh looked at the star chart, at the pulsing node, the convergence, the terminus, the place where every route ended, and whatever the Tessavari had built waited for the one voice patient enough to finish the map. Then he looked at his hands, the same hands that had held the projector, the same hands that had gestured at alcoves and display cases and silent artifacts for 7 years, shaping the air between the dead and the living, building bridges out of nothing but language and attention. Yes, he said. The word left his mouth and traveled through the gallery air, through the activated channels in the walls and floor and ceiling, through the 9 subsidiary artifacts that pulsed once in acknowledgement, through the obelisk stone body, and into the bedrock beneath the museum, where it reached whatever vast and patient mechanism the Tessavari had buried 9,000 years ago, and delivered the answer it had been built to receive. The obelisk did not flare, it did not roar, it did not shake the building or shatter the windows or fill the gallery with blinding light. What it did was simpler and more devastating than any of those things. It went quiet. The amber glow steadied to a constant, warm, unwavering radiance. No more pulses, no more reconfigurations, no more changes. The star chart on its surface locked into its final configuration and held. The metallic veins stopped flowing and set, the liquid mercury hardening into permanent channels that would hold this map for another 9,000 years if necessary. The voice went silent, not the silence of a dead thing, but the silence of a completed thing, a sentence that had reached its period, a road that had found its end. And in that new silence, Torek heard the sound that replaced it, a low, sustained harmonic rising from somewhere deep beneath the museum floor, from the substrate, from the bedrock, from the planet itself, as if the obelisk signal had not stopped but had been handed off to something larger, something buried so deep and built so old that the museum above it was a footnote, a way station, a rest stop on a road that ran through the bones of the world. The floor vibrated. Dr. Penne's diagnostic array chimed an alert she had never heard before. The security team shifted on their feet. The Hesserin archaeologists looked at each other, and then looked at the floor, and then looked at Torek with expressions he recognized from the field. The expression of professionals realizing they were standing on top of something they had not dug deep enough to find. Marsh felt it too. Torek could see it in his posture, the slight shift forward, the head tilting, the body of a man who had spent 7 years attuned to the vibrations of a building now feeling those vibrations answer him. There's something under the museum, Marsh said. Yes, Torek said. His voice was very quiet. I suspect there has been for a very long time. The harmonic deepened. The arched windows hummed in their frames. A hairline crack appeared in the gallery floor. Not a fracture, not a failure, but a seam, a deliberate division in the stonework that had been invisible for as long as the museum had existed, opening now along a line that ran from the base of the obelisk's pedestal straight to the eastern wall, where the pale daylight poured in through the tall arched windows and pooled on the floor like water. Along that seam, the same amber light that burned in the obelisk's veins began to rise through the stone, tracing the crack with a thin, bright line that glowed like a vein of molten gold in the cool blue-white wash of the twin suns. The line reached the eastern wall and turned. It ran up the wall's surface, following channels in the stonework that no one had ever noticed because they had been flush with the surrounding stone, invisible, inert, part of the building's architecture for so long that they had been catalogued as decorative masonry. Deshill let out a sound, a single, sharp intake of breath. She was pointing at the wall where the amber line climbed. At the masonry channels it was filling with light, and Torek saw what she saw at the same moment. The channels matched. The decorative stonework patterns they had all walked past every day, the ones the archive's original architects had preserved because they were aesthetically consistent with the period construction, were not decorative. They were the same geometric circuit language that covered the obelisk, the same inscriptions, the same topology. The building's architects had not designed them. They had inherited them, built around them, incorporated them into the structure without knowing what they were, the way a city builds roads over ancient foundations without understanding what the foundations were designed to carry. The line climbed to the ceiling. It branched. It spread. And as it spread, the south wing of the Hessoran Archive Museum revealed what it had always been, not a gallery, not a corridor, not a building designed to house artifacts, but an artifact itself. A navigation instrument built into the bedrock of Hessoran Prime by a civilization that had been dead for 9,000 years and had left behind not just a stone obelisk, but an entire building, an entire wing, an entire network of resonance channels embedded in the walls and floors and ceilings, waiting for the right voice to activate them. Dr. Penne's diagnostic array went into overload. Every sensor screamed at once: electromagnetic, thermal, vibrational, gravitational. She shut it down, rebooted, and the readings came back even higher. The gallery floor was producing a measurable gravitational anomaly. Not dangerous, the equivalent of standing on a body slightly more massive than Hessoran Prime, but present, real, and getting stronger. Something beneath the museum was powering up. One of the security guards, a veteran, a Hessoran male with 30 years of service, lowered his communicator and said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "The Foundation survey from when they built the East Extension. The engineers reported anomalous density readings in the substrate. The report was filed and forgotten." Torek looked at him. "I read it once," the guard said, 15 years ago, part of my security orientation. They said the bedrock under the south wing was too dense for its composition, too heavy. They assumed it was a natural mineral deposit. It was not a natural mineral deposit. Waiting for someone who walked the long road. The amber veins covered the ceiling now, a web of light that turned the south wing into a living star chart, the same chart that was inscribed on the obelisk's surface, but larger, room-sized, with every root and every node rendered in glowing metal channels that had been hidden in plain sight for centuries. The convergence node burned brightest of all, directly above Marsh's head, a point of warm gold light that hung in the ceiling like a stationary sun. The scholars and officials and security personnel in the corridor were pressed against the walls, looking up. Dr. Penne had lowered her diagnostic array and was simply staring. One of the Hessoran archaeologists, a woman named Deshill who had been on Torek's original excavation team on Keth Soranis, had tears running down her face. Torek understood why. He felt it too, not grief or not only grief. It was the particular emotion that came from standing inside a completed thing, an answered thing. 9,000 years of silence, and the silence had been a sentence that was still being spoken, and the sentence was finished now, and what it said was, "We built this for you, not for a conqueror, not for a chosen bloodline, not for the strongest or the smartest or the most powerful. For the one who would keep talking to the things we left behind. For the guide. Marsh stood in the center of the amber web and looked up at the convergence node above his head. His face was calm. There was no awe in it, no shock, just the steady, focused expression of a man who had always known, on some level he could not have articulated, that the walks he took through these halls were not routine, and the words he said to his tour groups were not script, and the silent artifacts he stood beside every day were not dead. They were listening. They had always been listening. And now they had heard enough. Torek walked to where Marsh stood. The amber light was warm on his Sethari skin, and the harmonic rising through the floor made his ankle bones ache in a way that felt, for the first time, not like a warning but like a welcome. The Tesavari built this museum, Torek said. It was not a question. Before the Hesseran archive existed, before the city above it was founded, before any of us arrived. Marsh spoke quietly, but his voice carried the way it always did in this corridor, the acoustics built for a voice exactly like his, tuned to frequencies the builders had calibrated for a species they had never met but had somehow known would come. They built the instrument first, then they built the building around it, then they waited. 9,000 years. However long it took. Torek looked at the obelisk. It was still glowing, still displaying the completed star chart, still holding the inscription that had rewritten itself when Marsh spoke. The 3 words "speak your route" were gone now, replaced by a single line in the same ancient trade script. The road is WLKD. The architect stands. Torek read it aloud. His voice cracked on the last word. He did not care. He was an excavation leader who had pulled dead things from the dirt of 11 worlds, and he was standing inside a living thing, a completed thing, a thing that had waited longer than his civilization had existed for a tour guide to finish a sentence that no one knew was being spoken. The amber light held. The star chart glowed. The building hummed its deep, patient harmonic, the sound of a machine that had been running for 9,000 years on nothing but the faith that someone would come, and someone would speak, and the long road would find its architect. Outside the arched windows, the twin suns of Hesseran Prime burned in a clear sky, and their light poured into the south wing and mixed with the amber glow of the activated veins, until the gallery was filled with a radiance that was neither alien nor human, but something older than both. The light of a road that had been walked in the dark for 9 millennia and was, at last, visible. Marsh sat down on the gallery bench. He set his projector beside him. He folded his hands in his lap and looked at the obelisk that had been his silent companion for 7 years and was silent no longer. He did not speak. He did not need to. The road was walked. The architect stood. And the map that 10,000 generations had drawn, voice by voice, root by root, word by patient word, was complete. In the corridor, Deshill wiped her face and opened her tablet and began, very quietly, to take notes. Dr. Penne picked up her diagnostic array and resumed scanning, her hands shaking. The security team stood at their posts. The Hesseran scholars pressed their palms together in the old gesture of witness. The acknowledgement that they had seen something that would outlast them, something that would be told and retold long after their names were forgotten, a story about a man who talked to silent things for a living and discovered that one of them had been listening the whole time. Torek remained standing beside Marsh for a long time. The amber light held steady. The harmonic in the floor settled to a frequency so low it was almost below sensation. The heartbeat of a building that had been sleeping and was now awake, not because someone powerful had commanded it, but because someone patient had earned it. 7 years, 2,400 tour, the same words, the same halls, the same silent artifacts, and underneath all of it, running through the walls and the floors and the bedrock itself like a current waiting for a circuit to close, the long road had been measuring him, not his knowledge, not his credentials, Not his species or his rank or his authority. His devotion. The thing he did every day without being asked. The thing he would have kept doing if the obelisk had stayed silent for another 9,000 years. The practice of standing before what was lost and saying, "This mattered. Someone built this. Someone was here." That was the root. That was the architecture. That was what the builders of the long road had crossed 10,000 generations to find. Not a scholar, not a conqueror, not a priest or a king, but a guide. A keeper of connections, a voice in the silence. An ordinary man who never stopped talking to things that couldn't answer. Until one of them did. And underneath the museum, buried in the bedrock of a world that had been built on top of it without knowing, the long road waited, its map complete, its architect named, its terminus charted for the first time in 9,000 years. Whatever the Tessavari had left at the convergence, whatever they had built at the end of every route their navigators had ever spoken, it waited too, patient, ready, as it had been since before the Hessoran archive existed, since before the city above it was founded, since before any species now living had learned to look up at the stars and wonder what was out there. The builders had known. They had charted every route. They had built the instruments and hidden them in plain sight and waited for the one voice patient enough to connect every node, every artifact, every silent piece of a map that spanned a galaxy. And the voice had come. Not a conqueror, not a prophet, not a scientist or a king. A guide 43 years old, soft-soled shoes. A handheld projector and a lanyard and a quiet, steady belief that the things people leave behind deserve to be remembered. The obelisk glowed, the building hummed, the long road at last had an end. And the man who had drawn the last line sat on a museum bench with his hands in his lap and waited, calmly, for whatever came next.